Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure because I kind of remember going to the Fresh Eye. I think it was what, like 10 years ago or something as a graduate student. So it's like also partly sentimental to me. So I'm sorry if I'm going to be that. Just please drop in the comments if I'm too much and I try to adjust myself. But anyway, who am I? And thanks, Andrea, for the introduction. But I want to kind of emphasize why am I here, right? So apart from being a big fan of games and writing about games and being mostly focused on those titles that could be termed indie or avant-garde or underground, I also did my master thesis about queer games, specifically about one of the queer games I'm about to show you. And I also lecture visual studies over at Faculty of Art, Charles University. So this is like sort of my background. So like I don't think, or I wouldn't call myself really academic. So what I've prepared for you is more of a kind of a very free-form dive into some concepts from queer theory, some concepts from game theory, and also some concepts from very contemporary, I think, feminist, radical, subversive, whatever theory. But first, we need to kind of, set the stage because I know we're on a Fresh Eye. I know this is a visual studies platform, but I want to emphasize very much that games aren't a thing that is there to be read in one way. I mean, this is probably very much true about any art form, but specifically in the games and the game studies, because it's fairly new field, there have been some very, like, in hindsight, super formalistic debates about whether games are more like text or whether they are more like systems of rules or whatever. And I think it's important that we look at games not just as visual objects, not as just audiovisual objects, but objects with like multiple affordances. I'm going to show you like some ways before we get to the examples how to think about games and what to look in games. But I think this multimodality, fancy academic word, is I think really key here. And also very much key to the whole aspect of queer and queering. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Yeah, because first, like, what are games, right? Like, there's this assumption, or at least I think, that when we are talking about games or video games, there is a still of shitload of some assumptions, right? I mean, I don't know what is your like first mental image of a game, but I bet it for a lot of people it's actually something, I don't know, along the lines of Counter-Strike, maybe like racing games, like the typical entertainment. And like the days where we had to fight for games as an art form are long overdue, but still it's very like I think important to say that games are today, as of in 2021, and in like the second decade of 21st century, are a ubiquitous, very broad, very diverse medium. And talking about games makes, I guess, as much sense as talking about films, right? So like you have Hollywood, you have Godard, like, and the same can be said about games. Like we have Blizzard, Warcraft, whatever. We have Underground, and I'm going to talk about where I situated this talk in just a little while. But I want to kind of just like, I think I kind of mixed my my slides there. But anyway, before we dive into the queer thing, I want to show you this. Yeah, admittedly, kind of off-putting chart, I think. But what is important is that unlike books or unlike movies or unlike, I don't know, almost any other more traditionally codified art form, perhaps apart from conceptual art and like very much contemporary art, there is a certain set of formal properties that it's easy to pinpoint, right? Like you have a book and it contains words, and like these words are formed either into stanzas in your poetry or into paragraphs. Sure, but like that there is some essence, at least like in some way, to be found definition. And with games, it's been quite a problem. because games are super multimodal, and like, if we say, yeah, games are something that you're supposed to be able to win, well, not quite. There's a lot of games with no winning conditions. Okay, so games are something like, we're competing in it. There are scores, there are action. Well, not really, because in a lot of games, and especially queer games, uh, no, there are no like valorized, another fancy word, outcomes. So, and I don't want to like, be super big here on game theory or anything. I just want to emphasize again that game is, I think, something that like really is composed of a lot of interlocking parts. Like we have aesthetic dimension, we have like the game mechanic dimension, we have perhaps like the contextual dimension, and all like works together somehow to create the whole thing that happens with us, or between us and the game when we're playing it. And before I kind of go into the queer thing, I want to just like quickly give shout out, and this is probably like a not required reading. I'm sorry, I'm not in my class, but suggested reading if queer games is or are something that you are interested in and you want to learn more about. I think those three books especially are super great to dive into. They are really accessible. The first one, The Queer Game Studies, is actually a book that I was drawing heavily from in my master thesis, and it's like it's a little old. It's 2017, I think now, and it's basically like an overview of queer game studies, because queer game studies is still like an emerging field of study, and it's super eclectic, kind of essay collection where you can find stuff that starts with queering game controllers and like feminist critique of the Xbox controller and like the X button, up to like trying to apply some horror visual studies or film studies devices onto contemporary games. And like the book basically ends up with like very community oriented projects and interviews. So this is like a very nice game studies or queer game studies primer. What is maybe a little more interesting to you, or could be, is the last book, The Queer Games Avant-Garde, and that's actually the book that's been super instrumental in me researching for this particular talk. And it includes interviews, I think, like a lot of them. It's like 20 interviews by this leading scholar, Bonnie Ruber, and they interviewed literally the leading figures in the queer game world. And so those are like the readings you could do if you want to learn more. And also, I think it's legal in Czech Republic. It's like you can borrow them on LibGen if you want. But where are we now, and like actually what we're going to talk about? There are several tensions in play. Okay, that was not pun intended actually, but it's quite nice. But there are several tensions in play here in my or like when we start to think about queer games, there are several like lines we have to cross, and one of them is the line between avant-garde and indie mainstream. What I mean by that, because when you Google queer games, queer game characters, queer game whatever, you will encounter, the first thing you'll encounter probably is something along Overwatch or something along AAA game, right? So we have I don't know how many of you are gamers. So like if you, okay, this is actually a good spot to, if you are a gamer, or like, please drop into the chat below. I'm watching it. Drop what, like, if you're a gamer, if you're playing, if you're familiar with what I'm talking about, so we can have like a little more. I know it's hard through the through the internet, but like at least we can have some sort of like at least partly like double way dialogue there. But we have the issue of queer representation in mainstream, and what's been happening together with like a more larger cultural shift in recognition of queer themes, at least in some parts of the society and world. There has been a quite increase, let's say, in representation of queer characters in AAA games. So like the clear example is Overwatch, which is this like massively multiplayer online shooter that is like very colorful. It's like super hit. It's made by a big hit studio, and it includes like these playable characters, like you can play as them and as heroes. It has like all this overarching lore that is like built through comic books and so forth, and it includes canonically queer characters. And what it does is the creators are introducing them like throughout the life cycle of the game. So like I think we learned the Tracer, which is the character there with this glowing gun and in the yellow body. I think she was like pronounced queer in what could have been the second or third year of the game, and the guy next to her, I think he's called Soldier 77 or something, or Soldier 7, and he's also queer or like revealed to be gay. He's been revealed to be gay like 3 years ago. So, and then you have games like Dragon Age, which have canonically trans characters, for example. You have like a multiple of games and like growing number of games that are like your typical gaming experience, right? So they are like adhering to like the standards that you'd expect from the video game industry. And the word industry is actually very important here, because when we're talking about this kind of queer representation, which I don't want to deal actually that much in this talk, there's always like the a little radical doubt that if it's being in like if it's earnest, right? Like, are we really achieving something by putting queer characters into mainstream games, which are otherwise following the same logic, often are made in like a very shady, like material conditions, with a lot of overtime, with like dubious amount of actual representation in the gaming process. And even though there is totally nothing wrong with like somebody identifying as queer and playing Overwatch and like being delighted that there is like an actually queer character, or I don't know, being trans playing Bayonetta, which is one of those characters, like super sexualized characters, but she's very often like read as queer because what queer is also excess, and also like the issue of reading something as queer is like a very understandable device in a world that is largely heteronormative. But there's like ever present danger of co-optation of queer becoming yet another box for marketers to sell, right? So like, is this the queerness we're looking for? And I'm actually asking this open-ended question with no clear answer, sort of draw attention to the disputed nature of asking what is queerness in games. And just like a little self promo, is this is a model I've kind of envisioned for my thesis, that's been actually inquiring about reception of an autobiographical queer game by queer people. It was a trans game by trans people. And again, we have like this stuff that there's an identification that arises from the interplay of engagement, aesthetics, and some what thing we call procedurality, which is like the game mechanics. And but like the question of queer coding and queer representation, I think it's essential to ask by who and for whom. And there is another like a very like interesting dissonance here between queer as identity, that like we're happy with having representation of different identities, and that's that, or queer as resistance, as some kind of very like attempt, or some kind of like brave, that's not the right word, but like some kind of attempt to dismantle or subvert or attack or reform or remix the things we are like perceiving as natural or as like typical for games, and to turn them around. So, and this is the difference actually between the queer and queering. And as you probably guessed from or can be difference, because those are obviously slippery terms. But as you probably guessed from the name of my lecture, I'm going to focus on queering example, which goes, by the way, hand in hand with queer. But to kind of, before we get to many examples I have, and I will have many, so please bear with me through this kind of a more academic introduction. I've actually picked two things or modes of interacting with games that that open themselves to queer interpretation. So first thing is the notion of counter gaming, which is actually a notion by this kind of a known video game scholar called Alexander Galloway, and it's been appropriated by theorist Edmund Y. Chang uh, to present multiple ways games can queer the medium itself. Because the games I'm about to show you are games that are in one way or another, be it visual, be it mechanical, be it metaphorical, are doing something not with the society, but also with the medium itself. And I'm presenting those ideas not with an aim to, I've read a lot of things, but to kind of, show you what, like the amount of things you can look for when I will be discussing different examples. So we have queer designing, queer play, we have queer remediation. Like the first two are quite self-explanatory. They are like subverting the dominant assumptions of what play and game design looks like, and like very different ways this can be present in games. I will get onto later. We have query mediation, which could be like using older forms of media, using older forms of games with some new playful way. And we have queer futures, which is obviously like imagining horizons that go beyond heteronormative productive life, that go beyond what is possible at this moment, and are very much tied to, I think, what perhaps has been with queer studies for some time. As an example would be Jose Esteban Munoz and his cruising utopias and queer utopias conceptions. And like B is like a different layers of games we can look for queerness in them, right? So like the first one is characters and stories. So what stories are there in the particular game? Are there any queer characters? What stories do they tell? Are those stories truthful? Are they made with queer people in mind? Then we have gameplay. We have question of agency. Who is the driving force in the game itself? What are the activities we can do in the game? Are those like the traditional ones? Or is the game trying to perhaps subvert something and valorize some other outcome than victory, and domination, and colonialism, and whatever? We have authors and means of production. We have the question of who makes games, for whom they make them. Are they paid enough? What channels are there for them to distribute their work? Are they represented enough in the very big blob of the medium we call video games? Aren't we overlooking them? Are they a legit part of the game community? And then we have communities and players, meaning queer events, queer expos, queer jams, queer support boards, games that are like on the verge of physical and digital world and all those stuff. So there are multiple layers we can look on queerness and try to find it in games. But before, I think this is the last stop before I will jump right into the yeah into the. Sorry, I just need my to rearrange it here. Before I jump into the long line of pictures, is the question of queer games and art, because thanks so much for the first two presentations, because I think they have raised issues that are going to connect very much with what I'm going to be showing and talking about. And one of them is the question of games and art. And I don't want to, be sorting the question, are games art here? Because obviously they are, or at least they can be, as much as films can be, and books can be, and I don't know, like any performance can be. But I want to kind of draw, and this is actually not my thought. It's from the book, one of those books. Is that actually there is like a long line of inspiration from art world, and especially from art movements like Dadaism or Situationism, that is very much tied to the concepts of play and experiment and creating some environments and situations where things can happen otherwise. And I think and actually this is the inspiration the inspiration from art is something that the artists themselves also talk about a lot. And so this is the connection between what we traditionally perceive as avant-garde art and what I'm talking about as avant-garde games is actually closer than you'd guess. So, and I like this only makes sense in a world where like we have art students making games over at Academy of Fine Arts. We have game students, game creators rising from the art background and so forth. So like I think we can only see those two worlds uh, getting closer and closer together. And I think queer games are something, or like are one of those touching points very clearly. But before we really get to the most fun part, I want to like just drop here one of the more interesting things that happened in contemporary feminist theory, I guess, and it's a glitch feminism book by Legacy Russell, and she put together this. It's actually part manifesto, part critical contemporary art reader, and it's basically if I should sum it up somehow, it's a very cybernetic way of doing feminism. Feminism that doesn't acknowledge something like in real world. Instead of in real world, you have away from keyboard. So it like totally um, is is prepared to utilize the cybernetic culture, and it's really much building on those like feminist and queer movements of the 90s, but with like a special angle on body embodiment, community building in the cyberspace, and also the function of bodies and identities in the whole techno matrix of like say Instagram or internet culture we have right now. So instead of direct actions, it speaks about glitches and about viruses, about encryptions, about errors, and ghosts, and like those like propagating. I'm looking for a word here. Sorry, I'm not a native speaker. Propagating changes, slight changes to the whole fabric system that can create some safe spaces or like new spaces or redefined spaces for what it even means to be, for example, queer or human or a woman or a person, right? So I don't want to go into depth really because this is not about that. But this, I think, it's very nice to like read games, especially those games which are disseminated today on Twitter and on various cybernetic networks, as being part of a larger cybernetic social justice movements. And like glitch feminism, I think it's very nice and very readable actually, and very poetic a perspective that can be applied to a lot of games I'm going to talk just in like 2 slides actually. And I want to end this like academic introduction, I think, or like more theoretical introduction with this great quote. What actually queerness in games is and queer has in common with games. This is a quote from the book Video Game Avant-Garde or Queer Video Game Avant-Garde by Bonnie Rubert. Queerness and video games share a common ethos, a longing to explore alternative ways of being. So basically, what all the people, all the creators, all the games I'm going to show in one way or another, in myriad different ways, are trying to do is to create and imagine something that goes beyond what is what is prescribed, what is heteronormative, what is usually deemed as the way things are supposed to be. And I kind of tried to organize my slides here and the games. Right, that's right. We will have a game just on the next slide into like very loose categories or devices they use to queer not only medium but also like to queer society as well. And the first one is embodiment and transgression. And I think this is pretty obvious in a case of Robert Yang. Robert Yang is also a theorist and a scholar and a person who's teaching at a New York's University Game Center, like a very prominent figure. And he has this series of very colorful, very cheeky, very fun gay queer games that are like entirely about game experience, right? So this first one is about showering. So like this basically a gay shower simulator. This second one They both are from a collection that's called Radiator. It has first and a second part, and this is like an actually a simulator of shifting gears in a car. Like by shifting gears, you're pleasuring the car, and the car responses. So it's like a this is very like a playful metaphor for some kind of like gay or like at least penis-based sex that is very much in line with playful nature of some artistic experiments. It's transgressive in a sense that it is not resigning on queer sexuality, and truth to be told, Yang's work is often banned on, for example, streaming platforms such as Twitch because they don't allow explicit content. So even though you can have like the most gorish and like abhorrent war stories there, like a nice BDSM consensual session, no way. So I think Yang's work not only shows what embodiment and playfulness can look like in games, but also shows the limit what queerness in the games can look like, right? Like, and this actually points to a very visible double standard when we have super sexualized but still covered women bodies, like for example in Overwatch, and then you have like a pretty innocent queer simulator of like sending consensual dick pics. That's another of his games, and that's not allowed for some reason. So yeah, go figure for yourself anyway. So I totally like all those games, and this is actually very true for a lot of games I'm going to be showing, are small vignettes trying to capture a singular experience. So like this one is spank me uh Spank Me Plenty or Hurt Me Plenty. I think it's called Hurt Me Plenty in a sort of like in video game culture joke on Doom, but it's basically just a BDSM. It's like a not vanilla but soft BDSM simulator with like a gay tones, and like it's actually just like he's trying to express his life, right? And this is what connects the world of art and world of art games and queer games and indie games and avant-garde games, because a lot of those games are directly inspired by queer lives. A second example of embodiment that is more metaphorical but also perhaps a little more, I don't know, universal, but I'm not sure. It's called Octodad, and it's actually a game where you're playing an octopus. It's the sentient octopus in a world where kind of everybody doesn't seem to notice that you are in fact an octopus, and you have to move around the space with those like long tentacles, and obviously it's hard, and obviously it's slippery, and obviously it's very inconvenient, and you might be asking what is queer about that, but actually this has been talked about quite a lot as a game that did for a lot of queer folk capture, for example, the feeling of undergoing bodily transition, or getting over some body issues. That like this is a great scene in Octodad where you're like preparing for a wedding, and you're like you need to get there and kiss your wife and kind of put the ring on, and it's like super typical heteronormative situation, but you're this weird alien, and like as we will see, this metaphor of being alien, of being monstrous, is something that is very consciously deployed by queer people as a metaphor or as a way of relating to some of more less, I think, like, well, not narratively, but like yeah, something that's like a little more tangible, like those bodily sensations that like present themselves as great opportunities for trying to somehow understand them through the game, because game offers the hands-on control, at least to some extent. And even though this is like a visual studies class, I think there's a lot of visuality to all those games. Like we have like this is like some kind of hyper realistic 3D game that also is like, I think, in a slight dialogue with like these HDR, biggest amount of polygons, the most polished way of doing AAA games. And then we have something that is like more cartoonish, more metaphorical, and then we have realistic kissing simulator, a really great online free game for 2 players actually, from author Jimmy Andrews and Lauren Schmidt, and it's a game where you basically play side to side on one keyboard, and you're trying to kind of kiss each other with tongues in like these 2 player kissing session, and it's totally awkward, and that is totally on purpose. And again, there's a multiple ways to read this. The visual metaphor for like non-coded bodies and like super minimalistic graphics is there. It's also very funny, and like it's obvious that a lot of queer art is actually very funny. And like you can either read this as a kind of a more general, and all of those readings are right, kind of a more general way of like, the awkwardness of trying to kiss somebody for the first time, or trying to get in tempo, or like with your partner, like actually feel like very similarly a lot of times. um, but at the same time, it very much speaks about some like the embodiment, like, right? So like when you're playing it, you're like not really in control of your body, and there's like a lot of awkward moments and weird moments, and moments that like are very embarrassing. And like, for example, I think when Bonnie and Rupert was talking about it in one of her talks, she was talking about it, or sorry, they were talking about it as an example of trans embodiment, where this reminded us, a lot of queer people, of their experience of kissing for the first time, like for example during transition. It's also queering the game in a mechanical sense. Then there is no goal, there's no victory. You actually have to consent before you can kiss, which is actually really nice. So it like teaches you some rules of consent. And also you can just like play indefinitely, so there it's like anti-productive game, right? So it's like a pure game where you're just embarrassed with your friend, partner, random person for how long you want to. Yeah, exploring queerness outside of sexuality theme comes back. Yeah, and we'll have more of those actually. So this was embodiment. And in one important thing, a lot of those games are freely available. So like you can, like this one is really freely available. A lot of work from Robert Yang is freely available. So feel free to try them for yourself. But then we have metaphor and appropriation. Like you can really see those are very loose, because obviously the previous games were also metaphorical. But I think Dysphoria, which is actually the game that brought me to queer game studies and the game I did my research on, is very interesting in this regard. It's a game that is basically composed of a lot of smaller mini games. It's a game by trans woman called Anna Anthropy. She's also been on the spearhead or forefront of this like queer game movement. I really urge you, if you're into this stuff, like Google her online. She also put out this book, Rise of Video Game Zinesters, trying to help aspiring authors to kind of create games with their own experiences. And this game specifically is about experience of undergoing medical transition. So there you have some sort of like metaphorical mini game where you have to fit with the weird shape into the wall, and it doesn't work and feels weird, and is a metaphor for a body in transition. You have like a mini game where everybody misgenders you. Then you have like 4 levels, gender hormonal medical bullshit. And I think this game is really telling of like very much different, also visual devices queer makers use. So the game Dysphoria is very obviously inspired by an older generation of video games. It's very admittedly a lo-fi, 8-bit. It kind of takes your control a little away from you, because it switches those scenes without your input. So you're really not in control. But this fact is actually very interesting because it can be interpreted as a anthropy, the author just letting you live through her memories, but not giving you control because it's not your life. And actually, when we are talking about queer lives and the question of agency, letting somebody else live your queer life is can be a very problematic thing, at least for a lot of people. And I think Dysphoria very beautifully combines playfulness and the feedback loop between game and the player, whilst not, but whilst still getting along or passing along the message that this is not your story to tell. This is not your game to win. This is my, like, not my, but her experience of transition that she decided to capture this way, and you're kind of a invested onlooker, right? And also, this game is very obviously inspired by WarioWare and like those kind of like very simple games from like a retro era. And actually, what was cited by a lot of people in my research, because I interviewed them after they played this game for the first time, and they were trans people, was that the metaphorical and very aesthetically simple and minimalist nature of the game actually helps them sympathize with the main character and identify with the hardships she is undergoing through. So this is another function of metaphor, I think, that games are good at, in a very limited manner, but still like eliciting some sort of empathy or immersion or identification. And for a lot of queer games, they deploy very minimalist and aestheticized and not real or hyper-real graphics. And I think this is apart the question of production value, because it's super hard to make like a flashy game, like a 3D flashy AAA game, but also it's just like on purpose because the metaphority allows your work to be perceived by a little more amount of people. One of the more interesting genres, or like the genres that is typically being used as a queer genre, are visual novels. And visual novels, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but visual novels are a genre that's been around for a long time, and it's a genre that is basically, I don't think this is really a good example, but this one is like a genre where you're basically having a conversation with people and asking them stuff and like reading a lot, making some decisions here and there. But basically, it's like an interactive fiction kind of thing, like right, like a game book sort of, with a heavy emphasis on visuals and like visual style. And visual novels, due to the easiness of their making and accessibility to a lot of tools, and they're grounding in like some sort of fandom, I'd say fandom communities, because there's a big, like huge amount of anime and manga themed visual novels have found their way as a genre into queer. And I think we've been seeing a great deal of interesting ones with like quite interesting mechanics. So one of the latest hits that is also available on mobile is If Found. And it is a game that needs to be played with video on, because it's a game that uses this very simple mechanic of erasing stuff. So basically, your finger acts like an eraser, and you're smudging your way through the different, different parts of the story of this young, as we will learn later, queer person struggling with being brought up in a very rural outreaches of Ireland, while being also simultaneously experiencing some sort of sci-fi, like end of the world scenario, right? And it's a very like personal story set in a very interesting locale, or interesting country and context. It's really refreshing to see a game about Ireland and full of Irish trivia. And also there's the mechanic of smudging and like like erasing your memories, history, and like trying to deal with the past with the aim of like getting into the present is very touching, and this game has been like super popular lately in the queer and indie game circles. Another example of where sex gets back is another BDSM themed game that is about actually cross-dressing girls. It's called Lady Killer in a Bind. It's by an author called Christine Love. And as you can see, we have a very wide range of aesthetic expression, with this one being very much in contact with some like anime-esque aesthetics. Yeah, and it's basically a BDSM game that like very much talks about consent and what does like the actual BDSM relationship, sub dom relationship looks like, and it's very much talking about topics that are not necessarily explored in the right way in the mainstream and in games, like not at all almost, right? But again, it's something that's very personal. It's also very cheeky, very fun, but at the same time, it's pushing boundaries of what can video games be used to tell stories about. And then we have Butterfly Soup, another free game about a lot of, or a bunch of queer teenagers growing up in like a typical high school. It's like a queer, super queer retelling of a high school drama with like very, uh, very diverse cast of characters. Uh, basically, all of them are girls with different nationalities and ethnicities, and there's a lot of love between them, a lot of heartbreaks between them, and like Butterfly Soup is heralded as one of those queer games that is very, very nicely and tactfully written, while also dealing with topics of coming up and being a gay inside a certain collective. And then we have consent. I've actually talked about consent like a little while ago, but we are again the question of the other and question of aliens and monstrosity comes back through this great, brilliant, and I really love to play the game that's called Consenticle that's being kickstarted, which I guess it's very interesting to just a queer game that's been kickstarted. That's cool. So we also have we can really see like a rising appreciation of queer works in video games, also through money. Like there are successful Kickstarters, there are successful, like hugely successful queer games. So we are now, I guess, in a position where you can make queer games and make money out of it to some extent. So that's really cool. But back to Consenticle. Consenticle basically is a card game which you can buy, print, and play. I have done so, and it's hilarious. And you play one of it's for two players. One of them plays as this alien, very hentai alien, I know, and the other one plays as this girl or person. Like I don't think she's gendered there, but like person, and you're in an intimate encounter. It's perhaps sex. It's not specifically stated, but like queer intimate encounters are not just about sex, right? So this is another like subtext in a lot of those games, and it's basically a game about consent and about empathy and about solidarity. So you have to communicate with your player or with the other player about what cards which are depicting like the different actions you can take with the body of the second player, and then like be in sync, be in tandem, and like play the right cards together. And there are like different different levels of difficulty. Basically, they mean how much you can communicate with the other player. But it's a game again where there is no actually win or lose. It's a cooperation, and card games, one versus one more, have traditionally been games about winning. So this is a game about actually cooperating and winning by making everybody happy in the end, whilst being so cute, and like everybody loves hentai tentacles. So nothing to not love here. Speaking of the other, we also have like some very explicit games. When I said at the beginning that it's very nice of Robert Yang that he doesn't refrain from showing queer sexuality, we also have a game that's called Hard Coded that doesn't refrain from showing trans sexuality through this metaphor or like a device or futuristic device or a persona of an android who is also part of sex, who is also part sex worker, and it's a very heart-warming, touching, also admittedly sexy and hot video game that like gives you control over her, and it's again super successful. It has a very big following on Patreon, and it's a game that is transgressive. It's sexual, but it's sexual in a way that actually there's a word for that, empowers, but also validates sexuality of trans women, not just as, some objects of desire, but as desiring objects or as desiring subjects. What is what I wanted to say. So there's a lot to be actually talked about in terms of erotic games. If you're into erotic games, please check out this journalist Anna Valance. I think I'm going to write it down in chat because I haven't put it in there. But she's really great. I did interview with her. She is exploring different ways queerness and sexuality and kink can intersect in gaming, and it's actually a very interesting subgenre of games that can show different ways of desiring, different ways of embodiment in sexual ways that can be very empowering for a lot of people. So that's that. And this tight ties with the game that is probably the most fun of all those, and and the most monstrous and also futuristic ones. And it's called Gendirect. Gendirect is a game that was made by Heather Flowers and Ryan Rose Essay. I'm not sure if I'm reading those names correctly because, again, I'm not a native speaker and those names are hard. But it's a game about fighting gender. So how do you seek to understand gender? It's a game full of very, very weird monsters. It's a game that allows you to choose a variety of different pronouns for you. Right here, you can even type those of yourself. And it's a game that really like playfully shows you many different ways of like relating to gender through the literal mouths of those monsters. And again, it's very aesthetically crude on purpose. It's very DIY. It's very unapologetically camp in like a very weird monstrous way. So Gendirect, really nice thing. It's also a visual novel, so like a lot of reading, but also super fun reading when like the mouth like tree with teeth tell you I'm certainly not masculine. Go figure. So it's like a really nice, very aesthetic exploration of queerness in ways that like not possible. We're thinking about queerness just as this token-like representation. Please let's have more queer snipers, right? So I want to have more queer tweets with teeth. So that was Gendirect, and we're slowing into the end. I promise. I'm probably talking more than 30 minutes. I'm sorry. And this is actually really nice. So this is a quote from the author of Gendirect, from the from Ryan Rose Essay, and she said, I want to make art that expresses how it feels to be trans, queer, and mentally ill, to feel like something at your very core is broken because you're assembled from scars and broken glass and pieces of trash so that others who feel the same way can take away the lesson that they are not alone in this world. And I think this really nicely captures the ethos of the games I'm showing you, because those are games made by queer people for not only but for queer people, drawing from their own experience and trying to conceptualize those experiences with devices that are very aesthetic. We also have this like really, I'm gonna be kind of quick here, just like take those two as a very good tips. We have a a visual novel that's called Who We Know the Devil from Pillow Fight Games, where we again have like a monstrosity and satanity as a sort of metaphor for transness and queerness. In some sort of, I'd say, cheeky dialogue with like these moral panics by religious conservatives. And then we have Will Be Mine, Heaven Will Be Mine, one of my most favorite games of like last 2 years, I think. It's a visual novel about girls, trans girls in, not only trans, but trans girls and queer girls in space, where they are fighting big robots. It's very clearly inspired by some mecha anime, but on this alternative future sci-fi background, it really talks lengths about emotion, about relationships, about fragility, about building a world for yourself that is somewhere other than planet Earth, as it turns out in the game's narrative. And it's beautifully written, by the way. Yes. And then last but not least, I think it's last but not least, I'm so sorry, it's Queer Memories. And I think no talk about queer games can be complete without Gone Home, which is one of the seminal games about queer experience. And it's a game from the genre that's called um, walking simulators. So basically, the game has a very little actual action. You're just basically returning home and going around this huge house and just shuffling through the things and like looking at things and reading old papers and interacting with the environment. And you're returning home, and then you suddenly find out that your sister was closeted queer, and you found the letter to her girlfriend, and you're forced to reckon with this queerness inside your family in the game, and like it all happens in like this domestic space. And yeah, it's in this very like low key traditional 3D world. And I think this is also something to keep in mind, that queer games can be very innocuous in a lot of ways and kind of subtle in their messages, and they don't have to be monstrous or monstrous eclectic combinations of various different things. So this has Gone Home. Again, I don't want to spoil it. You can. It's kind of old, so it's like 2014, I think, or 16 at this point. So you can like easily find it in some sort of sale. But it's one of the games that has really defined the discourse back in those days about what can you say in a video game about queerness. So queer as memory and queer as domestic identity. That's Gone Home. Yeah, and like last, I think, yeah, okay. I have 34 minutes, so I'm gonna end probably with this game, which is a game that is very beautiful and actually has a very interesting story. It's a game about success and failure, which are both very queer filled topics, and it's called Celeste. And it's this very hard platformer when you're controlling a young woman called Madeline, and when she's climbing this huge ass mountain. Yeah, so like, and it's basically this arcade game that is super hard, but can be accommodated even to like less experienced players because it has a very nice assist mode. But it's a game that is very literally about trying to overcome your fears and your anxieties and like the shadow of your former self. I'm not going to spoil it, but there are like literal episodes where you're fighting yourself in one way or another, and the goal is to get to the apex, right, to the top, which is like super empowering, like healing experience for Madeline as well for a lot of career players. And the game actually came out and was basically talked about a lot, like a metaphor for mental illnesses, metaphor for anxiety, and like very heartfelt story. And it's been adapted to some extent by queer people, but its author came out as trans, I think it was half a year ago, and actually said that she realized that the game is trans and that the Madeline is trans in like after completing it. that like her queerness kind of channeled through into the Celeste. So this is a game that is about queerness, but much more in an abstract way. And of course, with success comes failure. I don't think we have really like a time for this, but Thomas Was Alone is basically a puzzle game with like a different geometrical shapes and objects, and those objects are like have a very differing emotions and gender expressions. And this game was actually framed by queer theorist Jack Halberstam as an example of some sort of queer failure, all right? So like Jack Halberstam theorizes this notion of queer failure, where one of the constituting factors of queer identity is the failure to live the standards of heteronormativity, to follow the traditional productive life. Like you have childhood, teenagehood, adulthood, then you have mortgage, kids, whatever. Whilst when you're trans, you probably like have second puberty, or like your life is different from reproductive rights, right? So this failure to be heteronormative is something that can be exemplified a lot in games via visual and gaming metaphors. So that was like a last, I think, academic drop. And like this is the last game I want to show you actually is a game called Limb. When you're playing super abstract game, it's probably the most abstract game I've shown you yet. And it's a game about this colorful square, and you're asked to move through this spaces with different squares who are like reacting to you, and like the gameplay changes depending on how they react to you and you react to them. And it's a game that was made by a queer developer, Merit Kopaz, and it's a game about not like it can be interpreted, because obviously the author is dead and like you can interpret it as however you want. It's a game about trying to fit while not fitting everywhere at the same time. So again, we have like some kind of social failure. Like you can see, you can even like get outside the plane, the normal playing plane that is defined by the rest of the non-colorful rectangles. And like the Lim uses this very simple visual metaphor coupled with a very, and like this is why I urge you to play it, very hands-on distress when the vibration occur in the game that is trying to communicate a sense of kind of not fitting in whatever the system, the world, the society on now on the left is. And that was Lim. And I want to end up with like this is actually the last sentence of the book I was talking about, of the book The Queer Avant-Garde, the Queer Games Avant-Garde. These games and their creation represent the work of the body, of touch, of intimacy, of feeling, of political resistance that manifests as self-care, of queer identity and queer desire as a source of power. Queer games put the medium of video games to new purpose. Through these games, we as queer players and queer people are invited to reimagine our pasts and our futures, but also, and perhaps most importantly, the realities of our present. So this really captures the different aspects of all those games I've shown you. Like those are games that are trying to deal with some baggage of current video game world. They are subverting the current practices of video game world. They are in contact with larger queer communities and queer attitudes towards living, and they are also very powerful devices for capturing personal stories, personal feelings, and doing that in a unique way that combines aesthetic and mechanic elements together to create a very experience that is very much close to something which we very easily could call, without the tag video game, as contemporary queer art. And those are the three games that have been instrumental in my research and also in my thinking about queer games. So I'm gonna drop this presentation right away below so you don't forget it. And thank you very much.